just last week another bill the administration supports that enhances the deficit according to the Congressional Budget Office, raises the deficit by $400 billion. And so we have those two large fiscal pieces here. When Chair Waters asked, Secretary Yellen, when Chair Waters asked the chairman of the Federal Reserve whether or not spending more money from the fiscal house will improve inflation, I think what she asks, instead of improve, I want to translate for the public. When a Democrat says improve inflation, it means enhance or raise inflation, just to be clear, okay? So my friends on the left, when they say improve inflation, they want more of it. So, Secretary Yellen, to this point, now these things are imprecise, policy making is imprecise, but back in February, there was an output gap this administration acknowledged, right, in economic projections, and came to Congress for a fiscal stimulus in the name of COVID, but a fiscal stimulus, right? Is it fair to say that maybe you overshot in February?
Well, I think it's fair to say that we had a sizable fiscal stimulus. We were very concerned that the most significant risk facing the American economy was a shortage of jobs and a prolonged downturn that would scar many people, particularly the most
But in
vulnerable.
February, the output gap, right, versus what the fiscal stimulus was that your administration pushed for and got, perhaps you overshot. Is that fair to say? Is that a fair assumption?
Well, I don't think that's a fair assumption.
It's not. So Jason
we
Furman
addressed what was a very substantial risk, and as Chair Powell just mentioned, the United States.
Okay, so you think that fiscal reclaiming my time, Madam Chair.
Now, look, the inflation.
I'm asking a very particular question about the output gap. The output gap at the beginning of the year was $300 to $400 billion, right? Economists on the left and right were saying that was about right.
I think it was extremely hard under the circumstances to have any certainty.
And I'm asking a very reasonable question. As a policymaker. Okay, as a policymaker, I'm just asking you, you're a noted economist, right? Who's chair of the Federal Reserve. You're now in a very different position, having to, I think, sell what is a pretty lousy economic agenda, but you're doing a great job trying to sell this administration's agenda. The economic question that I hear from economists on the left now is that, and your former San Francisco Fed even acknowledges that February stimulus contributed to the inflation we're now experiencing.
Well, look, inflation.
Is that a fair assumption or not?
Inflation is a matter of demand and supply, and it's certainly true that the American Rescue Plan put money in people's pockets, helped them meet expenses that they had, and contributed to strong demand in the U.S. economy. But if you look at the amount of inflation that we have and its causes, that is at most a small contributor. The pandemic and what it's done to supply chains, diverting demand away from services and massively onto goods, which has resulted in supply chain problems and the impact we have seen that's now been long-lasting on labor supply due to the pandemic. I would say those are very important.
But there's a distinction here between a supply shock and a demand issue, right? Is that fair to understand?
The recovery plan did boost demand, and that's one reason that most households are in a favorable financial position, much better than they otherwise would have been, and it's enabled their spending. But the fact that the spending, because of the pandemic, has been so focused on goods as opposed to services has contributed massively to the supply chain problems that are boosting prices.
So, Madam Secretary, Chairman Powell, The Congress and the public and this administration wants to point everything onto the Federal Reserve on inflation. That is simply not the case. It is the multiple trillions of dollars that this Congress and this administration is spending that is putting jet fuel on the fires of this economy. It is making things worse. It is the policies of this administration. The chair went over time, and I'm going over time as well. So let me just say this. It is the administration's agenda here that I will finish my sentence here, Madam Chair, okay? It is the administration's agenda that is driving up the cost of things. It is making the American people worse off, not better off. Inflation is outpacing wage increases. This is on the Democrat House, Senate, and White House. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Financial Institutions, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you too for your service. I'm way over here today. Couple things. I'm listening to the publicans talk about inflation, but I think a more important topic we should be talking about is the fact that since the ex-president Trump was defeated by Joe Biden in November of last year, we've added almost 6 million jobs, some 620,000 jobs per month. And we've seen the stock market rise from 26,000 to 36,000. Now it's backed off to about 35,000 in the last year at $1.4 billion per point. It's almost up $13 trillion since Joe Biden won the election last year. We've seen GDP up dramatically over the last year. And my friends, I appreciate that the Republicans want to talk about inflation because that's all they can talk about. So I'd like to ask my first question of you, Secretary Yellen. Unemployment is falling at the fastest rate in 50 years and is now at 4.6%. Prior to the American Rescue Plan passing, the Congressional Budget Office projected it would take until the fourth quarter of 2023 to get to 4.6% unemployment. So we're 2 years ahead. Madam Secretary, my question is on Build Back Better, and how will it help in terms of the recovery and create more opportunities for everyday Americans?
Well, thank you for that question. Build Back Better is really focused on addressing long-term issues in our economy that have been holding back economic growth and contributing to economic inequality. An important aspect of Build Back Better is what it does for children and households with children. 2 years of universal early childhood education for 3 and 4-year-olds and subsidies for childcare to make quality childcare affordable for the great majority of households, along with a continuation, at least for a year, of the child tax credit that has made it possible for so many families to support the needs of their children, keep roofs over their heads, and diminished food insecurity. And these childcare provisions, as well as other parts of the program, should serve to boost labor force participation, particularly of women, where we've lagged behind most other developed countries. And research suggests that our failure to provide adequate child care and paid family leave is an important contributor. In addition,
Let me change the subject for 1 second. Just a subject that I've asked both of you about in the past, the Safe Banking Act, which involves allowing financial institutions to provide financial services to the cannabis industry and those that serve the cannabis industry. And you may know that we passed it with big bipartisan votes out of this committee, off the floor to the Senate last cycle, this cycle, and we amended the National Defense Authorization Act. So that's just to remind you where we are. In October, Cassidy Collins, a senior counsel in the Office of the Chief Counsel of the IRS, noted the special type of collection challenge the IRS undertakes regarding tax collection from cannabis-related businesses forced to operate in cash only. It's estimated that in just 3 states, nearly $50 million in taxes went unassessed because of unique issues surrounding the cannabis industry. Madam Secretary, do you agree? If these businesses were simply allowed to access the banking system and didn't have to transact business only in cash, it would make the IRS's job easier.
Yes, of course it would.
I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Missouri, Mrs. Wagner, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Secretary Yellen and Chair Powell, thank you for joining us today. And as I expressed to you earlier, Chair Powell, I want to congratulate you again on your renomination for another term leading the Federal Reserve Board. And I look forward to continuing to work with you. Chair Powell, you responded that our best expectation, this is your quote, our best expectation is there will be modest upward pressure on prices this year, but they won't be particularly large or persistent in the future. Chair Powell, since that hearing 8 months ago, I have asked you about higher inflation, and yes, to my good friend, the gentleman from Colorado, we're going to talk about inflation. That's all that people are talking about in my district, Missouri's 2nd Congressional District. They want to know why these prices keep going higher and higher and higher and higher. And no, I don't believe it's necessarily to fall at the foot of the Fed blame. It is Democrat policies and overspending. But I digress. I asked you about higher inflation 2 more times, sir. And Americans have experienced surging increases in, as I said, food, fuel, housing, leading up to the most expensive Thanksgiving, Christmas, and holiday season on record. Is it your view, sir, that these price increases still aren't, quote, particularly large or persistent?
No, that is no longer my view.
Thank you for that answer. Chair Powell, yesterday in the Senate Banking Committee, you stated that you believe it's time to retire the word transitory. I couldn't agree more. And to explain more clearly what the Fed means when referring to transitory inflation. I think most Americans, sir, define transitory as temporary, but the strain on their monthly budgets and paychecks from this inflation does not seem transitory or temporary. If that's not what you mean, then could you explain the Fed's meaning, please?
Or so the word transitory to some, as you suggest, has a sense of short-lived, a matter of months kind of thing. Whereas when we're using it in a specific way to say that transitory to us means that this episode, however lengthy it is, will not leave a persistent, long-run string of high inflation behind it. And the problem, our whole role that we play, it really revolves around having clear communication. When you have a word that means different things to different people, we just need to move on and find a better way to explain ourselves. And most forecasters still do think, overwhelmingly believe that inflation will come down significantly in the second half of next year. But as I've said, the risks of higher inflation have moved up. Higher, more persistent.
Is soaring debt and deficits and excessive spending and dumping stimulus spending after stimulus spending after stimulus spending into our economy, will that be a driver of inflation?
So I guess I would say, I don't want to comment on fiscal policy directly.
I'm just
but
saying in general.
In general, so if you go back to last March, the median of the blue chip, the best resourced forecasters thought that inflation would be right about at our target, March of this year. What was wrong with that analysis was really that we understood demand would be strong. We didn't understand how the significant problems of the supply side, which are very hard, they were unique.
And how much money there would be in households and in the
demand is
system.
very, very strong, both from no question, from fiscal policy and also from
Fiscal policy.
the quickly rebounding economy. The economy is very strong now.
I agree. So, Secretary Yellen, let me ask you, the CBO, and they reflect one of the more conservative scores, has said that Biden's spending bill, the most recent one, will add $367 billion to the deficit. Could you describe the long-term consequences of too much fiscal spending on financial markets and the price of consumer goods?
So let me first put the CBO number that you mentioned in perspective. They did score Build Back Better as resulting in $367
Yes.
billion in deficits over 10 years, not in a year, but over 10 years.
Well, there were a lot of gimmicks that went through
However-
to get that number too.
However,
Let's be honest.
the score, they made clear, does not include the revenue that will come from enhancement of resources for tax enforcement. It doesn't include that.
How does
And
this
Treasury-
overspending
Treasury-
on our financial markets and
Gentlewoman's time has
deal with the
expired.
price of consumer goods? I'd like the
Gentlewoman's-
gentlelady to
Gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. And I'd like to thank Secretary Yellen and Chair Powell for being here with us on such an important occasion at this critical moment, and talk about a couple of questions of issues that we have that have affected our district. My first question is to Secretary Yellen. Secretary, when you testified before this committee in July, you identified caregiving needs as one of the major barriers people face in getting back to work following the COVID pandemic. Studies over 80% of South Texans residing in my congressional district identify as Latino, but only 19.5% of 3 and 4-year-olds are enrolled in publicly funded preschool. What impact do you think Build Back Better Act will have in supporting our economic recovery and getting folks back to work? I know we're talking about this labor shortage, but specifically, do you believe investing in child care and universal pre-K will bolster our economic and labor market recovery?
Yes, I absolutely do. As I mentioned previously, one of the reasons that even before the pandemic, women's labor force participation in the United States fell short of that in many developed countries is the lack of public support for childcare and paid family leave. And during the pandemic, this became so much worse because of the issues in childcare and schools not being open, but many childcare facilities closed, and people who work in childcare that involves face-to-face contact, health concerns have held people back from going to work there. So Build Back Better will subsidize childcare so that it's affordable for almost all American families, and provide 2 years of universal pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds. And research that Treasury recently summarized in a working paper shows that this will boost labor supply, particularly that of women. And more recently, the Congressional Budget Office also published a paper that opines that this is likely to have positive impacts on employment.
Thank you. And as you know, in the CARES Act we established the Paycheck Protection Program, which has been administered by the SBA in concert with Treasury to provide economic relief and emergency payroll support to small businesses hit most by the pandemic. The program provided a lifeline for many small businesses in my district and across the country. But however, we reached a struggle to reach businesses in communities of color. And as I mentioned earlier, over 80% of my district is Latino, and over 19,000 businesses applied for PPP. Only 23.25 identified as Latino. How can we look at this information and learn how to better reach minority-owned businesses to ensure they have the same access to these resources? And what are we doing to make this happen?
Yes, Well, I mean, in the more recent payroll protection program, priority was given to CDFIs and MDIs to have access to those funds in order to provide better support to minority areas. And going forward, Congress has provided considerable resources to CDFIs and to MDIs. And what we've found is that these institutions have great ability to reach businesses in underserved areas. So the CDFI program that we run in Treasury is very focused on making sure that that support gets out, and we expect these institutions to play a significant role in the state small business credit initiative that we recently issued guidelines for.
Thank you. And lastly, I just want to ask a question on the Emergency Capital Investment Program that was established and consolidated on the Appropriations Act of 2021 to encourage low and moderate income community financial institutions to bolster their efforts to support and engage with small businesses in their communities. I understand the deadline to submit application
The gentleman's
for the
time
program
has
was
expired.
Okay, thank you.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Taylor, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. Chairman Powell, I'm sure you're familiar with Milton Friedman's treatise, Free to Choose.
Yes.
And this is a important, college textbook, I would think, on economics. And I would commend Chapter 9 to you, The Cure for Inflation. It is, I think it is, Mr. Friedman lays out some important premises of what creates inflation. And I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that the M2 money supply has gone up very dramatically. You're familiar with the Federal Reserve holdings and trillions of dollars of debt, the very dramatic increase on your balance sheet. I know you're aware of this because you were there. And the money in circulation. And this comports with, again, going back to Chapter 9 of Milton Friedman's book, and he goes in and talks about the inflation that took place in the 1970s, and he has a series of charts showing the supply of money. So here's the United States, and he goes on and shows the supply of money in Germany and Japan and the increase in prices, and then also the United Kingdom and Brazil. And so all of this is going to a very central point that when you increase money, and actually let me quote Mr. Friedman here for a second. When the quantity of money increases more rapidly than the quantity of goods and services available for purchase, we have inflation. You have printed too much money, sir, and that money has created inflation. To stop the inflation, I would recommend to you to stop printing the money. You indicated yesterday that you're going to start to slow down the printing of money. I think you should stop it, and stop it right now. Inflation is on the minds of Americans. Poll after poll for the last many months, 70, 80% of Americans, it's a top issue for them. They're concerned about inflation. Inflation is eating away their purchasing power. It is actually robbing them of the increases in wages that we've seen because their purchasing power is down because of the inflation that's created by the money that's being printed. Would you like to respond to that?
Sure. So price stability is one of our two goals, the other being maximum employment. We have to balance those two goals when they're in tension as they are right now, but I assure you we will use our tools to make sure that this high inflation we're experiencing does not become entrenched. If I may also add, though, the connection between monetary aggregates and either growth or inflation was very strong for a long, long time, which ended about 40 years ago. So the so-called velocity of money became quite variable. And so now we think more of just the imbalances between supply and demand in the real economy rather than monetary aggregates, which isn't to say that that was wrong when written. I think it was probably correct when it was written, but it's been a different economy and a different financial system for some time. Nonetheless, your point on inflation, well taken.
Well, and I appreciate that. And I just, Secretary Yellen, don't you think that the deficit spending that this administration, on an unparalleled level, right? I mean, the $2 trillion in deficit spending in February, dumping money into the economy, has created the inflation that we see today.
Well, the Build Back Better plan that's under consideration now is paid for.
Okay, but the $2 trillion in February, was that paid for?
The rescue plan was not paid for.
Okay, so that's
It
$2
did
trillion in
involve-
deficit spending.
There was a very good reason to pass that. We faced a major risk in terms of seeing our workforce, particularly the most vulnerable members of the American society, scarred permanently, losing homes, being unable to put food on their tables, take care of their children, and being permanently financially harmed, as well as there was a shortage of demand in the economy that could have resulted in long-lasting joblessness and high unemployment. And the plan that was enacted into law was focused on dealing with that, and it's been successful.
Did it create
But
inflation? Did $2 trillion of deficit spending create inflation?
It did boost demand, and that is one of several factors that are involved in inflation. But we, absent the pandemic and the supply chain problems we've had and the negative impact the pandemic has
Secretary
had
Yellen,
on the
with-
supply of labor.
What's interesting to
wouldn't
me,
be-
Secretary Yellen, if I could just to finish here, what's interesting is that Milton Friedman wrote in 1979, no government is willing to accept responsibility for producing inflation. And you, ma'am, have just embodied that denial because your spending, your deficit spending is creating the inflation that the Americans need relief from now. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Guam, Mr. San Nicolas, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd like to begin by clarifying the fact that the deficit spending just referred to was to address the pandemic concerns that was impacting this country. The unemployment of our people, the fact that there were so many businesses that needed support, and one of the reasons why we enacted the relief packages that we did was to make sure that we didn't collapse our economy as a result of these pandemic circumstances. So let's make sure we're bifurcating the issues here and not just hammering away on, what happened in the past and trying to tie it into the present. And with that, I'd like to talk about the present. It looks like the narrative of the minority is to try and pin the inflationary circumstances of this country on the fiscal policy that's being pursued by the sitting government. And I think it's important for us to remember that just a few months ago, the very same minority in similar hearings as this was stating that they were upset that the rollout of relief funding was not happening fast enough. That's entirely juxtaposed to the inflationary arguments being presented today. They were arguing for us to push even more money into the financial system, into the monetary supply. So, I really hope that we can go back to that mentality, because getting help to the American people during the pandemic was and is a priority, and continuing to get help to the American people in our infrastructure and in the many good things in Build Back Better should also continue to be a priority. It needs to further be reminded that Build Back Better has not even been enacted yet. Its fiscal impacts have not been materialized. It's not entering into the money supply. And we've recently just had testimony that inflation is running at a certain clip up to October. I believe it was mentioned by Chairman Powell at 5%. And I think that that's important for us to contextualize, because we are suffering from inflation, but the inflationary pressures are not as a result of the recently passed Build Back Better that still remains to be enacted. That being said, I would like, without objections, Madam Chair, to enter to the record an article dated October 15, 2021 by Paul Hannon in London, Brian Dube in Lima, and Stella Yifan Shi in Hong Kong on the Wall Street Journal, entitled "Inflation Surges Worldwide as COVID-19 Lockdowns End and Supply Chains Can't Cope." Without objections, Madam
Without
Chair.
objection is so ordered.
And in that vein, I'd like to pose a question to Chairman Powell. Mr. Chairman, is the inflation that we're enduring here in America today, is it just occurring in America, or is there a global inflationary environment?
So, as you mentioned, there's, if you look at Western Europe, Germany in particular, you look at the United Kingdom, look at Canada, you're seeing high rates of inflation in many of these countries, less so in Asia, but certainly in most parts of Europe and Canada and the United States.
Is it fair to state that these inflationary pressures that are occurring globally are predominantly as a result of the normalization that's starting to occur from the economies getting back on their feet due to the pandemic?
Yeah, so when you see something happening everywhere around the world, you look for common factors, and and those would be just the reopening of the economy, which imposes COVID continues to impose supply side constraints. So whatever demand there is runs up against hard constraints, which is unusual for market economies, and you're seeing high inflation everywhere. You're seeing many of the same features that we're seeing here. You're seeing elsewhere, but different countries are feeling it to different degrees.
So just in that context, let's not hold back the American people by creating some kind of inflationary scare, making it seem like it's a fiscal policy issue. This is a global inflationary environment. Let's continue to take care of the American people while we allow the experts that are testifying before us today to continue guiding us as we try and tackle inflation. Moving on to Secretary Yellen, I want to first begin by recognizing some of your staff. JJ Richetti and Arian Rubio, special assistants that have been working closely with our office. They help us to do our job in engaging Treasury and allow you to come here today and do your job to be able to ask questions and answer questions directly from us. I just had one quick question, Secretary Yellen. My local governor is holding off on expending some resources that were provided under the local relief package. I think they're waiting to see what the final rule is on the spending of the local recovery funds. Is the final rule going to be materially different from the interim rule, or can we expect it to be materially the same?
Well, we're in the final stages of producing the final rule. It's undergoing review. We had thousands of comments and have tried to respond until that rule comes out, but we expect it to come out shortly. The interim rule applies and can be relied on.
The gentleman's time has expired. Just as a
Time has
courtesy.
expired. Yield back.
Thank you. All members are instructed, if they have not exhausted their questions, of course, to submit in writing and follow up. At this time, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Zeldin, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to Secretary Yellen and Chairman Powell for being here today. Thank you to Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry for holding this hearing. First, to start with you, Secretary Yellen, just now in response to Mr. Taylor's questioning, I believe you said that it's your position that the Build Back Better bill is fully paid for. Did I hear you correctly?
Well, let me be clear. We agree with the CBO analysis that led to a score of a $367 billion deficit over 10 years. But CBO was explicit that their analysis did not include revenue that would result from an $80 billion investment over 10 years in the IRS. And the Office of Tax Analysis issued a paper with our own estimate based on our data and information that we have from the IRS about the likely payoff from that, and we estimate that at $400 billion. So, and as when we put together those two pieces of information,
Thank you.
it is more than fully paid for.
I appreciate you clarifying. So the administration's position is that you believe that it's fully paid for by ramping up the amount of IRS agents that are out there by several tens of thousands and going after more Americans to try to get them to pay more in taxes. I believe the number is up over 80,000 more IRS agents, and we have some strong disagreement with regards to that proposal. I'm hearing from a lot of constituents who don't want to see several tens of thousands of additional IRS agents to be added to be going after hardworking Americans across the country, because we already have enough IRS agents out there to go after individuals. And they're also concerned with the proposal to be spying on bank accounts and transactions at low dollar amounts. Chairman Powell, you asked a question with regards to, you were talking about inflation, and I just want to understand this correctly. You said that the second half of next year that you believe inflation will start coming down. Is that accurate that you stated that?
So our forecast, many, I'd say almost all forecasters do expect that inflation will be coming down meaningfully in the second half of next year. That's an expectation. That's
And-
forecast.
And just so that I understand, is that something that you agree with?
I think it's likely, but I don't think, I mean, the point is we can't act as though we're sure of that. We're not at all sure of that. Inflation has been more persistent and higher than we've expected, and we have to use our policy to address the range of plausible outcomes, not just the most likely one, which is that one. That is the most likely, but there are other possibilities, and we're well aware of that.
And when you say that answer, I just want to understand that in the context of an additional question with regards to the Build Back Better bill. You were asked whether or not that would, what kind of an effect that would have on inflation, and you refused to comment on that. So my question is, the prediction that in the second half of next year that it's likely that inflation would come down, is that a prediction assuming that the Build Back Better bill is law or not law? Is that the trillions of dollars is spent or not spent?
You know, it's really not our role to comment on fiscal proposals indirectly or directly. So what we do.
That's not what I'm asking.
Well-
The prediction that that inflation is going to go down in the second half of next year is either built on an assumption that there is going to be trillions of dollars spent or not spent.
So the
Which
principle-
assumption was used in
The
making
principal
that prediction?
driving assumptions would be these, that the goods inflation that we're seeing will subside because the supply chain problems will sort themselves out. At the same time, though, you're going to see rent inflation going up, and you're going to see
I think
possible
you might be
wages pushing up.
misunderstanding me, Chairman. With all due respect, the prediction, I'm trying to understand whether or not.
So there will be a
You're-
fiscal prediction. It will be in there. People will make different assumptions, but of course we will assume. At this point, we're assuming that something passes, but we don't know exactly what it's going to be. It's very hard to be precise because, again, we don't know what will pass.
That leaves far more questions than answers with regards to the prediction. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, who is also the vice chair of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Financial Institutions, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The House just passed the Build Back Better Act. We're closer than ever to delivering overdue support for workers, for families, and the economy. There's truly just so much for us to feel hopeful about. Unfortunately, many Republicans are working overtime to distract from these historic accomplishments. Today, they speak about inflation, and they speak about it without any nuance or any context, and they refuse to put forth serious solutions. They use their platforms to discourage people from getting vaccinated, which will only prolong pandemic-induced inflation. They spread lies that the Build Back Better Act will add to the deficit, despite 3 years ago enthusiastically passing Trump's tax break for the wealthy bill, knowing it would add $2 trillion to the deficit. I'm tired of the fear-mongering and misinformation, so let's today, in this moment, set the record straight about the Build Back Better Act. Secretary Yellen, please answer yes or no to these questions wherever possible. Would providing universal pre-K and drastically cutting the cost of childcare have a positive impact on the economy?
Yes, I believe it would. It would promote higher labor force participation, and these investments in children would have a significant payoff, making them more successful and better prepared to succeed in our economy.
And would making prescription drugs cheaper for seniors and families have a positive impact on the economy? Yes or no?
Yes, it would certainly cut the cost of living, especially for retirees who have been struggling with the cost of prescription drugs, but many others as well.
And would investing in more affordable housing have a positive impact on the economy? Yes or no?
Yes, I think that's been a very significant problem for decades and has made it exceptionally difficult, especially for lower income families, to manage in expensive parts of the country.
And with the expansion of the child tax credit, a tax cut for the lowest earning families have a positive impact on the economy, yes or no?
Yes, and it's already done so in the months after the child tax credit has been paid out. We've seen a substantial decrease in the number of families reporting food insecurity.
So 0 Republicans, 0, voted for the Build Back Better Act, despite it containing substantial, serious, and popular solutions to combat inflation, supply chain issues, and financial hardship, solutions that are fully paid for. To try to justify their no vote, they are spreading lies about this bill. They say the bill will cause long-term inflation. Wrong. That is a falsehood. They say it will add to the deficit. Wrong. That is a falsehood. Anything to delay solutions and distract the public from their government spending hypocrisy. Secretary Yellen, what are the real causes of inflation, and how will policies that stop the spread of COVID-19 and support labor participation help to fight it?
Well, to my mind, the real causes of inflation reflect the impact the pandemic has had on the economy. The programs that have supported income have kept demand at a solid pace and enabled our economy to grow the fastest of any economy, to bring down unemployment toward more normal levels. But because of the pandemic, demand shifted massively away from services and toward goods. That huge demand for goods has resulted in massive supply chain bottlenecks that have crippled our ports and transportation system and caused a shortage of semiconductors that have led to huge increases in the price of new and used vehicles. And because of the pandemic, a substantial number of workers have not returned to the labor force, I believe because they are concerned about the health consequences of working in face-to-face type jobs, and probably also because of childcare concerns.
Secretary Yellen, in the remaining time I have, I do want to give you the floor to talk about the revenue-raising provisions that will pay for the Build Back Better Act's investments. How will they both make wealthy corporations? Sorry, I yield.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to both Chairman Powell and Secretary Yellen for being with us today. Congratulations to Chairman Powell on your reappointment. Secretary Yellen, I'll start with you. Earlier you said, and I think you've said it in different ways a few times, when supply and demand get out of balance, you can have inflation, and the demand side has accelerated while we still have supply chain bottlenecks. Fair?
The demand has been strong. Demand has also shifted away from services and toward goods, which has created huge problems, more than the aggregate level of demand.
Yes, ma'am. And the American Rescue Plan, which was a partisan bill, that juiced supply, or I'm sorry, that increased demand, which you testified to, did it do anything to alleviate supply issues?
It didn't have substantial impacts on supply.
So when we say that, and this is my frustration, for a year plus, we negotiated in good faith bipartisan legislation to be targeted and appropriate with respect to our response to COVID-19. You all won the election. It's your prerogative to ignore Republican concerns, but you went forward with the American Rescue Plan, which we warned would increase inflation, specifically for the reasons the Secretary just said. It would increase demand and do nothing to alleviate supply chain bottlenecks. That's exactly what happened. You're set to repeat the exact same mistake with Build Back Better. Chairman Powell, I want to commend you for retiring the term transitory as it relates to inflation. My constituents have been complaining about it for over a year. Two concerns. One, inflation is particularly hard on low and middle income Americans, in particular those with fixed incomes. We all know that. It's been brutal for them. Two, and I think this is the new risk accumulates over time the longer rates are at zero, as anyone who invests money and discounts cash flows at a zero interest rate can justify virtually any investment. As we've seen that in various asset bubbles have built up over time. So now I think the risk shifts. Now I believe the risk is that we have let inflation run too hot for too long, and we're in need of a more sudden course correction, which you suggested yesterday. That being the case, what are you most concerned with when considering the ramifications of the taper on the market and the economy at large? What pockets of risk are you looking at as the taper begins?
Let me just say, I think that the taper need not be a disruptive event in markets. I don't expect that it will be. It hasn't been so far. We've telegraphed it. I mean, I think if you look at the state of the economy, look at where we are, look at the most recent run of data, you can see that the highly accommodative policy that we have, even after the taper is done, it's really appropriate that we taper. And as I mentioned yesterday,
I agree,
in my view, it's appropriate that we consider at the next meeting tapering faster so that it wraps up a few months earlier.
Yeah, I agree. I guess I would encourage you, and my concern again is we've seen asset bubbles accumulate over the course of the pandemic. Investors have done incredibly well. I think we should be tapering. I agree with Van in a lot of ways on the monetary front. But I suspect that there's risk building up, and I just want to make sure that it's on the Fed's radar. I want to shift to a minute and 26 seconds to see if we get this out. So in recent months, Americans have unfortunately seen energy prices significantly increase, especially at the pump. Some people who talk on Twitter have claimed that this is due to greedy corporations and speculators driving up prices. Do you believe that's the reason for increased gas prices?
So energy is a global market, and there are many, many factors at work there. I would say it's a combination of very strong demand across the board,
But not
and a number of
greedy
supply side factors too.
Not greedy corporations and speculators driving up prices. That's not accurate for why energy prices are high.
You know, looking at this from an economic perspective, it's very strong demand in the face of what have been some supply blockages and a little bit of discipline on the part of the providers.
Thank you. I agree. In the summer of 2020, the Federal Reserve updated its statement of longer run goals and monetary policy strategy to state that the Fed would seek to achieve inflation above 2% for some time period. Do you have any second thoughts on that, given that we've seen inflation persist for quite some time? And how would, if we didn't change the framework, how would you potentially have responded differently throughout the pandemic?
So the sort of overarching fact of monetary policy in the last 15 years and probably the next 15 years is just that interest rates are significantly closer to the effective to zero. And in that world, it's hard to support the economy and attain growth and maximum employment and 2% inflation. So the framework was designed to address a situation in that. Now, what we have here is a unique historical shock, which is the beginning of the pandemic, the middle of it, and the end of it. And so you have a different situation and we have a different part of the framework that deals with that.
The gentleman's time has
Thank
expired.
you. I'll follow up in writing. Thank
I'd
you.
be glad to.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Chairman.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman, and thank you both for being here. President Biden stated with your renomination, Chairman, that you would use your authority to address the threat that climate changes poses to our financial system. As you know, if we allow temperatures to rise above another 2 degrees this century, we are surrendering the planet and our environment to corporate polluters, accepting, of course, the disruption to our agriculture, our trade, migration on a massive, unprecedented scale, and the devastating public health impacts. And Chairman, you should know this is so personal for me because I'm seeing it firsthand in Michigan, where Wayne County hasn't met Clean Air Act standards since 2013. This is the largest populated county in Michigan. And not only with record floods that have impacted families during the pandemic, we're talking about 4 times alone in some households over the summer. It is devastating. We need to do something about it, and I know it directly impacts our economy. So Chairman Powell, can you outline precisely what your plan is to fulfill that commitment to address climate risks to our financial system?
I'd be glad to. So the Fed has a couple of ways that we will address climate that are important, but they're not by themselves going to be enough. The first of which is just to supervise and regulate financial institutions, particularly the large ones, to make sure that they understand the risks that they're running and can manage them. The second really is, from a financial stability standpoint, climate change has potentially significant effects on financial stability, and also on the broader economy. So we do a lot of research. Our researchers are some of the ones around the globe who are doing the original research to understand the pathway of climate change through the financial system and the economy. And those are within our mandate to supervise firms and look after financial stability. We will be incorporating climate change very much into those mandates.
So you know, and I know you've heard it, between 2016 to 2020, banks provided, what, $3.8 trillion in direct fossil fuel financing, with most of that investment coming from banking, banks that are holding companies under the Fed's supervision. And I know you're talking about oversight here, but the acting controller of the currency, Michael Hsu, has announced that the OCC plans to issue supervisory guidance on climate risk by the end of the year. Chairman, I mean, does the Fed intend to join this guidance? Why or why not?
I don't think we'll join this specific guidance. We're very much tracking and in discussions with the OCC. I think we will move to certainly to provide guidance, and I think we all the agencies want to have consistent or identical ideally guidance. I don't think we'll actually be in a position to join this specific guidance at this time, but we'll get there.
And you know, the OCC will also begin examining how large banks are addressing climate risk as part of the examination starting in 2022. So does the Fed plan on conducting a similar assessment in 2022? And what is the Fed planning to do on assessing climate risk to banks face in 2022?
So in 2022, we're already deep into dialogue, and again, particularly with the largest financial institutions. That's really where a lot of the work is going on right now. Ongoing dialogue with all of them, and they are, by the way, they're doing the same thing we're doing, just trying to understand the implications of climate change for their business model, for the things that they do, and also what we're thinking about is what's the appropriate supervisory approach? How do we do this? Which tools do we use? For example, climate scenario analysis.
And I just, on behalf of my residents, I hope dialogue turns into guidance and accountability. Finally, I'm glad you've allowed the leadership of other central banks, in joining, you joined the network for greening the financial system last year. Really appreciate it, but as Governor Bernard has indicated, the U.S. still trails other countries in, quote, measuring, monitoring, managing climate-related financial risks. And we need to, quote, he said, governor said, we need to catch up. And they go on to say, Chairman Powell, about how far back we are in regards to having much more active role. And so, Chairman Powell, the European Central Bank has announced the climate risk will guide its monetary policy. Will the Federal Reserve do the same? Are you actually aggressively looking at taking this kind of an approach?
So, I mean, I'm focused on the United States and our existing mandates.
Is that a no?
Well,
it's no right now.
It's a sort of a broader question than a yes or no.
I mean, they're saying, okay, we're going to use climate risk to guide our monetary policy.
Okay, well, specifically narrowly then, I would say we're not doing that now. I think that's something we'll do in the longer run, but no, we're not doing it.
Not now, okay. As a result of the ECB's initial supervisor review revealed that the banks face material risks from climate risk, yet have failed to meet the supervisor expectations laid out by the regulators. Chairman Powell, do you have a similar comprehensive information about how U.S. banks are positioned? I'll submit the question.
We're developing that.
You are good.
We're in the
That's
development
excellent.
phase on that.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gooden, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Secretary Yellen, I have a few questions. If Build Back Better becomes law, which earlier you stated it was paid for, and one of the tools for payment was enhanced collections from the IRS, if this does become law, would you anticipate that more Americans will be audited by the IRS?